A lot of times I get asked in class, how do you control the inks? Well, alcohol inks are fantastic for letting go of some of our control issues. But if you're looking to create and build something that actually looks like something else, whether it's abstract or even a little more realistic, collage is a great way to do that with alcohol inks. You can take your colors together, cut them up, arrange them, and then seal them up to make beautiful compositions. So today, let's check out how to make alcohol ink collages. If you don't have an idea to start with your scraps. They will inspire you. Organize them however you see fit. Once you get your stacks of scraps organized, take a look at your larger pieces. These will serve as backgrounds for you. And then take a look at some color combinations. What looks good on top of another? If you are starting with an image or an idea in mind, start to arrange your samples so that they fit. When I was doing my toucan, I knew that I would need greens, so I arranged all of those in a stack, and then I started to look at the colors that I wanted to use for a toucan. I didn't need to be realistic here, but I did want to look at some dark and light values that were specific to a toucan. I started with a reference photo. Now, this is a photo that I took. Yeah, there's a lot of branches in the way, but I could still see the toucan, and I used him as inspiration for a very simple line drawing. Here is my line drawing. Now, maybe sketching isn't your thing, and that's okay. You can always blow up your photo and just trace it. That's totally fine. The key here is that you want it to be simple. Very, very tiny pieces or overly complicated line drawings are going to be a little difficult here. So you want to go big and you want to go simple. So blow things up and simplify. Once you have your drawing, then you're going to use carbon paper. This is a transfer paper that I simply taped on the back to where the carbon side will touch whatever I lay it onto. So here I can take a piece of paper, lay this down on it, take a dull pencil or ballpoint pen and trace over the shape that I want to cut out. When I do that, the carbon paper transfers onto whatever surface I've put it on. You will be tracing this onto the ink itself, so you'll want to cut inside the lines. But if you don't want to show any pencil lines at all, you can always do it on the back. Just keep in mind that your image will be flipped if you do that. Once you get your pieces cut out, it's time to arrange your composition. So here I have put my background down and I can start to play around with how these pieces are all going to fit together. While I use the transfer paper for the parts of my toucan, I actually just free-handed some organic branch and leaf shapes with some scissors. At this stage, you don't have to be afraid of anything. Try all different compositions, see what looks best, and take photos along the way. You can use these photos as reference when you're putting your final work together. Now we need to mount our work. Anything larger than an 8x10 should be mounted to something. A rigid hardboard or even a canvas. I'm going to use resin on this particular piece, and I'm going to mount it to an 11x14 stretched canvas. If you're using resin, consider a rigid hardboard substrate for anything larger than a 16x20. You don't want the flexibility of the canvas to cause cracking over time. 11x14 should be just fine. I know that I'm going to use multiple layers of resin here. If you don't necessarily want to go all in and start using resin just to cut up and collage with your alcohol inks, no worries. There's an easy way to do that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, let's get this coated. Working with resin is far easier than one might think. You want to use gloves and then make sure that you're working on a level, elevated surface so that you're not gluing your piece to your table. In this case, I put thumbtacks behind my canvas and then simply put a level on top of it to make sure it was an even surface. To trowel the resin on, I'm using a piece of heavyweight Yupo. And yes, you may notice this has some ink on it. The heavyweight Yupo is much more rigid than the medium weight and has a nice crisp edge. This is going to be perfect for a trowel and a great way to use up a scrap. Here I'm using Art Resin. That's my go-to for any alcohol ink project. It does not re-wet alcohol inks. It has a very simple 1-to-1 ratio where you mix the two parts together and you're ready to go. Use a popsicle stick or something to make sure that you get all of the material out of your cup so you don't mess with your equal parts ratio. Once these two parts are in the same cup, you'll want to mix them for 3 or 4 minutes. I usually set a timer just to make sure, but you can actually see the magic happen. You'll want to use your popsicle stick to scrape the sides and bottom as you go, making sure that the mixture is complete. Along the way, you'll notice some bubbles start to happen, things get a little blurry, things get a little hazy, and then they kind of go back to clear. Make sure that you mix for the full amount of time and that the resin has returned back to crystal clear. When working with smaller amounts, it's easy to go too fast. Remember, we're stirring, not whipping. The faster you go, the more bubbles you're going to incorporate. And you don't want a whipped, fluffy concoction. You want to just stir this. Now, of course, you will get some bubbles in here, and we will be able to get rid of those later, and I'll show you how. You can place your bottles of resin in a warm water bath before you mix them together. This heats up their temperature and lowers their viscosity, making it easier to stir and easier for the bubbles to get out. Raising the temperature also speeds up the setup time. I actually don't want to do that for this particular project because I want all of the working time that I can get when I'm placing my pieces down. For this reason, I'm going to be okay with bubbles and I'm going to get them out with a torch later. Now I'm going to place my background down and make sure that all of the edges are well adhered to the canvas. Now let's get a full coat on top of the background so that we can start to put our collage pieces on top. Remember, you want a very thin coat here. If it's thick, your pieces will kind of float around on top and you'll constantly have to kind of adjust them. A nice, thin, full coverage coat is what we're looking for. You'll want to think about what you want to do with the edges ahead of time. If they're going to be visible, consider taping them off and then peeling the tape off after the resin is tacky but not fully cured. You can also scrape the edges as you go along to make sure that they're free of any drips. In this case, I know that I'm going to put this into a cradled frame. The edges won't be visible at all. So for this piece, those edges can drip away. Now's a good time to torch it. Using a culinary torch, small butane torch, something like that, you're simply going to run it quickly across the surface and watch those bubbles get eliminated. You'll see this process in action on the last layer. Now that the bubbles are torched out, I'm going to place my cut pieces on top of the wet resin and arrange them according to my reference photo. Of course, things will change along the way. I'm using Art Resin here for a few different reasons. The biggest one is that it does not re-wet alcohol inks. So many different sealers, adhesives, all types of things re-wet alcohol inks. So if you're not using Art Resin, make sure that you run a test first. Additionally, and this is a big one, Art Resin has no VOCs. That means it's environmentally friendly and I can work in a well-ventilated studio. At this point, you can place all of your cut pieces down as long as there's not too much overlapping. If you have pieces that are going to go directly on top of another piece and not touch any resin to effectively glue it down, then you're going to want to work in layers. That's what I'm doing with this piece. I'm going to put some cut pieces down, let that fully cure overnight, and then come back and put a fresh new coat of resin on top and put some more layers down. After you put some pieces down, if you notice some bubbles appear, use a straw and gently blow to get those to the surface and pop. Using the torch at this point is a little tricky because if you get it on your Yupo, that's plastic and it can melt or burn and change the colors of your inks. After the resin is cured, I'm going to flip this over onto a cutting mat and cut off any excess scraps that I have hanging over the edges. This is good to do in between each layer, that way they don't build up. Now it's time for a fresh layer of resin, a torch to get those bubbles out, and some new pieces on top. This particular work was inspired from a recent trip that we took to Belize. The ancient Mayan ruins, birds, and butterflies of Belize gave me so much fuel for many future works. Our adventures there were unbelievable, and if you're interested in checking any of that out, you can find the link to our travel channel in the description of this video. And I'll put the Adventures of Belize on the end screen. We absolutely love travel and sharing the experience of visiting new cultures, finding new art, and seeing all the wildlife and amazing things there are out there. So, if you're interested in going to a place and want some tips, or maybe you just want to virtually travel, check out one of our videos. And if anything in this video has inspired you or given you some ideas, it's a big help if you could hit that like button. This helps circulate the video and share it to more people so that we can all be more creative. Now it's time to let this layer cure, about 24 hours, and then I'll add some additional pieces on top. You can repeat this process as many times as you want. Sometimes I like to do just a little at a time, giving me the most flexibility in how my composition evolves. In this resin layer, you can really see the bubbles as I pour it down. As I spread it out, they will seem to disappear. But in the studio, I can see them. They're everywhere, so it's time to torch it out. Move quickly with the flame just above the surface. This is a very fast and easy process, and you don't want to focus on a spot for too long because you're not looking at heating it up. You just need to get those bubbles out real quick. And here's the finished product, sealed, framed, and ready to go. But not everything needs to be gallery ready. If you're going through your scraps and just looking to repurpose them, you may not want to go all the way into resining these things, but you can still make a collage and just tack it together for the fun of it, just to get some new ideas. Here's how to do that. In order just to tack things down, I'm going to use Claro Extender. This is from Pinata Color's alcohol ink. This is the binder without any color whatsoever in it. Now, it will re-wet inks, so I don't just want to pour this everywhere. In fact, most glues and adhesives will re-wet the inks in some way. What I like about using the Claro Extender is that it re-wets the inks the way they're supposed to. It looks intentional if you happen to see it out from underneath another piece. It's as fluid as any other alcohol ink, so you can scoot things around if you need to, although that does produce a smudge mark, so you got to be careful what direction you're going. You can even use the alcohol ink colors to affix one piece to another. You just need to be careful that you're working in a color family where it makes sense if a little bit of that color leaks out. For this one, I used the lime green, which was a prominent color throughout the piece. These will take a few hours before they're stuck and won't scoot anymore, but once they're there, it's a good tack that can hold things down in place, and then if you like what you got, of course, you can absolutely put a coat of resin over that. Glue sticks work well too. They're not as fluid as the alcohol inks are and give you a more immediate tack. They also don't re-wet the inks as quickly, so while they can smudge it and you'll get some residue that comes off, it's not a full re-wetting of the ink. You can also use acrylic mediums for sticking pieces together too. The key here is that all of these are going to re-wet the ink in some way. So, be careful if you get any on your hands and touch the surface of an area that you don't want to smudge or move around. This can be a little cumbersome if you're working with a lot of pieces, which is why if you're working on something that you've got a real plan for, sometimes resin is the best way to go. Once you get a composition that you like, let it dry and you're done. If you're going to sell it or show it in a gallery, then I would recommend sealing it with some resin. These adhesives do stick things together, but they don't last forever. This really does need a full sealer on top of it to hold things all in one place. But if you're just keeping it for your own sake and don't want to go that extra mile, put it behind glass and show it off. I hope this has given you some good ideas on new ways to work with your inks. I'll see you next time on Art Resin with Lynn.